In your world, in a TTRPG setting, do dwarves have a place? Do elves have a place? What about humans? Races in TTRPGs have actually lost their impact over the years, but for lots of weird reasons. Let's talk about that. One of the biggest things and one of the biggest steps forward that we can talk about when it comes to TTRPGs and races, especially in Dungeons & Dragons, is the lack of their specificity. What do I mean by that? Dwarves used to be heavy on constitution, and then elves were dexterous if they were wood elves, or intelligent if they're high elves, and humans were worthless because they just had a +1 stat to everything. The mechanics of the race influenced the overall society of that race. Well, as players, some of us players said, well, I want to play an elf that's very strong. And so therefore we eventually allowed people to take their stats and shift them to allow for characters and player development to play the things they wanted to play. That's okay. It's also okay to say, hey, all of elves get a +2 to intelligence and a +1 to dex. Nothing wrong with that as elves. And then you as a player can be different. You can be the big buff elf, which makes you different than everyone else. It is okay to have your players be different than the race, but still have the race have their normal attributes as far as they go. The thing is while we're trying to be inclusive, we're also creating a mesh of all the races as if they're all the same. And the goal was, it's a game, and those races, it's not like our own world. It's not a reflection of our own world. It's a way for us to group things together. If you want a world that doesn't group things together and everyone lives together, then what's the conflict? So it's both good and it's both bad, and it both doesn't matter. What matters is your table and your game and the story that you as a group are trying to tell. You can tell that story, and you as a dungeon master can do what you want to do. As a dungeon master, when it comes to races, you don't have to include or uninclude or disinclude or follow any rules except for the ones you want, as long as you tell your players before they sit down at the table. And so what does this have to do with the kind of blending of the races? Well, every race kind of has its own theme. As a dungeon master, I can retell that theme, making races different. Meaning, what if the orcs were not the bad guys? What if it was the dwarves? And the dwarves were catching the orcs and putting them to slavery. Well, why would I even talk about that? To create conflict. To show you that a race could be bad just based upon their merits, and the orcs have been misunderstood because they're just trying to survive as they're being slaved by the dwarves. Remember, TTRPGs are a group storytelling device. We use these races, these organizations, to create divides within the game, to create the story. What if humans were a virus, spreading across the world, consuming everything because they were short-lived? They were so short-minded that they couldn't see past their own lives, and every other race was watching as humanity washed over the world. That would be an interesting story too. Remember, the goal is to create conflict, to create differences, so that way you can actually see those changes. When it comes to races in TTRPG, we've kind of blended them together, allowing characters and players to do pretty much whatever they want. You, as a player, as a dungeon master, get to decide what to allow and what not to allow. If you don't want there to be strong elves because they're all dexterous, you don't have to. But as a player, if you want that to happen and the DM doesn't allow it, you don't have to sit at that table. Remember something, we're telling stories as a group, and if you don't want to play a game a certain way, you as a player don't have to join that table. You as a dungeon master don't have to actually adhere to that. So keep that in mind when anyone says, hey, I don't allow goblins, I don't allow elves, because we get to play whatever game we want to play. The final thing that I have when it comes to races in Dungeons & Dragons really comes down to being able to choose and play the game that you want to play and the character that you want to play. The dungeon master doesn't have to allow it. The players don't have to do it. Those are all very valid options. So remember, tell the dungeon master what you're trying to accomplish. Be transparent. Dungeon masters, help your players tell the story they want to tell. If something doesn't work where a race is not fitting within the campaign, how could it, and what challenges would that player kind of have? And so we have kind of taken races in TTRPG and done with them as a reflection of society as opposed to a game mechanic. So here's my question to all the dungeon masters and all the players out there. Should races be a game mechanic, or should they be a reflection of society? Should there even be races in Dungeons & Dragons? I really don't have an answer to this. In my campaigns, in the games that I play, I use dwarves, I use elves, I use humans as to create different variants. Dwarves sometimes may not have separate kingdoms. Sometimes they might. Orcs may be one giant tribe, or they may be different tribes. But why do I make orcs always tribal? I don't. In fact, orcs actually used to be miners, and the dwarves forced them out of the mountains. And then they went and lived in the plains, trying to gain their land back. I've used those divides between the races to create clear divides for cultural purposes to show there's a difference. In humans, we have nations. And as humans, being the shortest lived of most of the races, that was always what we did. We had nations that had similar cultural components. So what do you think? Do you think that this is a good thing, a bad thing, a game mechanics thing? I will always use races for game mechanic. And I encourage my players to stick with what's decided. For example, if you want to play a dwarf, you're going to get a +2 to Constitution and a +1 to Strength. That is what a dwarf is. And the thing is, if you want to be a dwarf casting, a dwarf wizard, well, guess what? Lean into those secondary stats, that Constitution with a high intelligence. And then maybe you don't have such a high charisma, but you do have a higher Constitution, which allows you for better concentration. So lean into those secondary stats where you have the +2s and +1s and make them part of the character to make your character different. I'm still strong, I'm still tough, but I'm also smart. What do you think about doing that? This is a very controversial topic, and there is no right answer, there is no wrong answer. There's simply your table. And I encourage you as a dungeon master and you as a player to play however you want to play. Whether it's Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder 2e, Call of Cthulhu, remember, y'all are telling a story together. Tell that amazing story and keep playing. We'll see you next time, guys. And always like, subscribe, comment below. And I've already said once, we'll see you next time.